Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to be starting the webinar at 12 o'clock sharp, and that gives us about a minute here, everybody, to get adjusted. All microphones are off except for the speakers. However, we will be having questions and answers by way of the Q&A feature of Zoom. So anytime you think of a question during the presentation here or during the discussion here, put your question in. We have another member of the party here today in the background fielding all the questions, and when we are done with the discussion, we'll just start going through the questions one after the other. So we're going to give this another 10 seconds, and then we're going to get started. Okay, I think we're good. So this is the beginning. Welcome. This is a SCORE webinar. This is our first discussion webinar. We will not be having any PowerPoint slides today. We'll just be going back and forth. I am Bill Petrovic. I'm a SCORE mentor. I've been mentoring at SCORE for about 7 years. I'm also responsible for the workshops at SCORE. And I have with me today Matt Neff. Before we get started with that, I just say a couple words about SCORE. Most of you know about it because we advertise this to our SCORE clients, either people who've had mentoring at SCORE, people who've come to our workshops, but there may be others on the call or on the webinar that got the link from a friend, and that's fine too. And SCORE is a group of volunteers. We are part of a national organization. There are over 300 chapters. They're in the largest cities around the country. Our chapter is serving Indianapolis and surrounding area. We have about 80 or so mentors who do volunteer regularly. We usually meet face-to-face, but we've been using Zoom or conference calls over the last month or so, and that's working out pretty well. The topic today is restarting your business, and Matt Neff is joining me as our expert, and I'll say a few things about Matt's background. This is similar to what we had on the landing page when you went to sign up for this, but Matt is a graduate of, guess where? Yes, DePaul, which is visible in a chronological order to say he practiced law for 12 years, and then he was the deputy of to the chairman of the Federal Housing Finance Board. And one of his projects there was to work on their first ever strategic plan. And beyond that, he founded 3 companies on the entrepreneurial side of his activities. So one was an insurance acquisition firm, another was a healthcare finance firm, and finally a venture capital firm. So he's been in touch with entrepreneurs throughout most of his career. He's in fact the former chairman and president of AIT Labs, which is in Lafayette, and he has and does serve on multiple boards of directors, and he is senior counsel to the law firm of Denton's Bingham Greenbaum LLP, and I believe that's here in Indianapolis. So Matt, we're glad you're here. Matt's an entrepreneur, an investor, a lawyer, and expert on strategy, and we're going to be talking about how to restart your business. So let's just start with this question. You came to my attention based on an article that you wrote for the IBJ a few weeks ago, and maybe you could just mention how you got the idea for that article?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Bill. I have written several articles for the IBJ over the years, and they have to do primarily with entrepreneurial topics, sometimes legal topics, sometimes healthcare related, but primarily business strategy and business leadership. And my board service, I sit on the board of a couple of companies. One of them is a publicly traded lab company in West Lafayette. And then, as you pointed out, I used to be the CEO of AIT Labs here in Indy. But I'm also on the board of Hotel Tango Whiskey, as well as a hospital here in town. So in my capacity as a board member, I'm thinking about the implications of the pandemic. What does it do to our business model? And everyone is kind of in this state of suspended animation these days. But we'll be coming out of it very soon, I hope. And how do we prepare for restarting? How have the rules of the game changed during this period of hibernation that we've all been in? How have the economics changed? What are the assumptions that we made in our original strategic plan that are going to be affected by everything that's happened? So I was, in my capacity as a board member, I was thinking about those issues. I've been, as you pointed out, the CEO of a couple of different companies, one of which is a venture capital firm that is owned by Indiana University Health. So we invested in 15 companies with IU Health money. And in order to get to, venture capital is in many respects a numbers game, right? In order to get to 15 investments, we looked at over 1,000 companies. And the venture capital discipline is a very healthy thing. And one of the tenets of it is kind of a continuous revisitation of assumptions and strategies that is enforced by having a lot of statistical data about the business that you invest in. So that also led to my thinking about the IBJ article. And then finally, it was just kind of a thought that crossed my mind that as we're all, sitting at home, getting into kind of the routine, is there a risk of stasis? That is, because we're not operating perhaps at the level that we were before, is there a risk that we slow down, stop pushing the envelope in terms of our thought process, get comfortable with a different pace than what will have to be achieved when the businesses reopen? And so it was really that last thought that caused me to write the article.
Okay, great. I enjoyed the article, and I also listened to the podcast that kind of went along with it. So I think we're going to cover a lot of interesting topics today. One thing I need to mention on the housekeeping side is Zoom offers both a question and answer opportunity and a chat opportunity. We're only using the Q&A for everybody who's watching, so don't let your questions get trapped in the chat room. Okay, great. So your article mentioned what you called a 90-day sprint, and that goes along with the concept of venture capital. It's a venture capital concept, I understand. How does that work in that world, and how does that apply here?
Well, in the context of a broader business plan or a strategic plan for a business, which is typically multi-year, 3 to 5 years would be typical, reduced to a 1-year kind of tactical plan. But ideally, it's then broken down into quarters. And the businesses that I've been involved in, we further refined kind of the quarterly objectives into key performance indicators, measurements that we could talk about on a weekly basis. And so the concept of the 90-day sprint is frequently used in venture capital as a way to, after you initially make the investment, your capital has been put in, you want to get off to a quick start, right? You want to get out of the blocks quickly. So you work to develop a 90-day view of, all right, how can we kickstart things to a higher level of performance and develop the metrics that create kind of stretch goals for the management team. And so that's the concept of the 90-day sprint. There's no real magic to it. It is essentially assume that your business is reopened now, post-pandemic, and for the 90 days after that, what would you like to do in order to get to maximum operating efficiency and get as close to your performance objectives as are possible? And really critical to that, critical to the concept of a 90-day sprint is the communication that goes with it. It's not something that I would recommend that the CEO develop in isolation and then distribute to all employees. It's something that is better developed from the ground up, where you talk to everybody about it. What are good stretch goals that we all think we can accomplish? That fosters not only good communication about what those goals are, but also fosters a sense of ownership. And ownership, the sense that people have had a role in developing those goals, is really critical to making them happen.
You also mentioned in the article key performance indicators, and that's kind of tied into what you're just mentioning. But could you just take that term, key performance indicator, and do a little training or concept explanation on that for those who might not even be using them currently?
Yeah, or they may have a different name in different businesses, but I refer to them as key performance indicators, KPIs. And KPIs are the quantification of operating metrics that are important for a particular business. You know, everybody monitors revenue, everybody monitors expenses, but there are other ratios or measurements of efficiency that you would want to use to know that you're operating at full capacity, right? So it might be a quick ratio. What are your short-term liabilities over your short-term assets? It might be, I'm involved in Hotel Tango whiskey, for example. One of the KPIs that we use at Hotel Tango is order to bill time. So an order comes in, how long does it take for us to bottle and ship those bottles and turn it into a bill? So it's the passage of time, it's billing efficiency. Other things that you might measure in that kind of a business would be bottles packed per hour. How many bottles filled and actually packed ready for shipping? What is the throughput of your stills? How many gallons per hour are being run through a particular still to know whether you're operating it at maximum efficiency? Those are examples, but each business will have its own measurements that it will want to track. And if they haven't been identified yet, one of my recommendations would be figure out what those are and quantify them. The Japanese have a saying that if you can't measure it, it's just a slogan. And I have found that to be true. Not everything in life can be captured in a number or a metric, but in most business operations, there are metrics that, if they're not perfect, they at least serve as an early warning for a problem. And so I have found that the use of KPIs is very valuable.
Could it be something even simpler, like phone calls received versus orders taken?
Yeah.
even digging back deeper into your website, visits to your website, something really far up the chain there. At least something you're keeping an eye on, and gives you kind of an idea that there might be a problem coming.
Right, and each business will have kind of unique metrics that they're going to want to track. So your website might be relevant depending on your business. If you're monitoring the sales cycle, your sales funnel, how many outbound calls are being made, how many conversations is that leading to, how many leads, and then just the sales funnel of okay, how many orders did we get out of that effort, and keeping track of the efficiency of that would be another great example. I don't know if you've ever heard of a book called Traction. Traction is something that we use. Right now, I'm involved with a private equity firm, and this private equity firm uses Traction-like principles to help its portfolio companies become as efficient as possible. And there's an expression in the book, Traction, which says that everybody needs to own a number, right? If you're the CEO, the number is profit. But if you're the supervisor of the bottling facility at Hotel Tango, the number is something different. The point is that everybody ought to know what their numbers are and keep track of them so that they're accountable for them. Now, the flip side of that is, you don't want to overwhelm people with so many different metrics that they lose their force. So you want to be selective and focus on just the critical KPIs.
Okay, that's good. That sort of leads me to the next thought. And right now, this lockdown, I'll call it, is it can really mess with your mind. And especially if you have a business that you're essentially cut off from. It's not like it was before. How do you suggest people become remotivated, reactivated to instead of being consumed by just the magnitude of the issues at the moment?
Well, I mean, business owners know that they have to be very disciplined. They have to get in the right frame of mind. As an entrepreneur, I can appreciate that things happen only when you make them happen. And an entrepreneur or CEO of a company is generally acutely aware of that fact. One of the things that I think you have to be careful about is the importance of delegation. If you're the CEO of a business of almost any size, unless it's maybe a two-person business, you're going to have to delegate things. You've got to realize that nobody is good at everything. And what you want to do is delegate tasks to people who are uniquely good at those tasks and that you're either not good at or they don't have the return on investment of your time that they would otherwise. So you've got to be disciplined in terms of delegating, identifying the task at hand, defining or refining the KPIs that you're going to measure, and then making sure that you've delegated to the right people the critical tasks. Early on in my career as an entrepreneur, I took a course, kind of a 3-year program called the Strategic Coach. And very, very, very good course, very good discipline, which I have used for 25 years. And in the Strategic Coach program, there is a concept called the ceiling of complexity. And that is that a CEO can be overwhelmed if they are trying to take charge of too many details. You've got to let go and delegate things so that you can get through that ceiling of complexity and kind of get your head above water and look around and focus on bigger strategic issues. So I think the importance of delegation at a time like this is really important. Hopefully the people on the call have strong team members that can stand up to the challenge of taking on more responsibilities coming out of this lockdown, as you say.
Great. What we're in now is never happened in our lifetime. And we're going to start things kind of like all over again. So things have gone from normal to zero and then coming back, trying to get back to normal. What are your thoughts on how this might change the competitive landscape?
Well, you're right. This is unique. I mean, it's different than the prior financial crisis. It's different than even World War II, right? Because everything stopped at the same time. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think about that both supply and demand, in most cases, were halted at about the same time. And how do you deal with a situation like that? Well, for starters, and I made this point in my IBJ article, because it is unique, there is a silver lining to it, and that is that everybody stopped at the same time, and everybody's going to restart at about the same time. Even if you're in a state where there's some kind of staging of restarts, I think you should assume that your competition is going to restart at 100%. They're not going to scale up very likely. I would assume that they're going to be back in full force. So you want to be ready to hit it hard as soon as you can. And that's the analogy that I used for that was the difference between the Indy 500 and the Kentucky Derby. In the Indy 500, there are pace laps, and then the pace car leaves the track, the green flag falls, and all the cars are starting the race, but they're all operating at about the same speed. The Kentucky Derby, on the other hand, the horses are all in the gate, and they're starting from a dead stop. They all start at the same time from a dead stop. And I think the situation that we're in currently is more like the Kentucky Derby than the Indy 500. There probably won't be time for pace laps to catch up. It'll be the bell rings, the gate opens, and your business is off and running, which in my mind makes it even more important that you think about this in advance and have a strategy, because engagement level will go up very quickly.
One of the things that you mentioned in your article as well was concerning in the role as a leader. One of the jobs of a leader is, as you put it, look around corners. It seems like there's a lot of corners right now that need to be looked around. Could you kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, in my view, and maybe not all CEOs would agree with this statement, but in my view, an important role of a business leader is to instigate the conversations about, okay, how are we going to adjust our strategy given the change in circumstances here? Nobody has all of the answers. And I think that there is wisdom in the crowd, so to speak. So my approach would be to talk with your leadership team and people that work with you and develop a consensus about that strategy. Because as you point out, Bill, nobody's ever been through this before. So good news is nobody else has all of the answers. The bad news is you don't either. So you got to be prepared to develop consensus within your group. You've got to be really strong in communicating, right? Because people are going to be a little shell-shocked after this experience, I have to think. They're not going to know exactly how to conduct themselves. Are they going to be wearing masks? Do they have to stay 6 feet apart? Is it safe in the office? I'm working in a warehouse. How's that going to work? Communication is really going to be of paramount importance in a situation like this. And so I think that recognizing that nobody has all of the answers, but asking the hard questions and putting them out there for people to contribute to so that they own the answer, I think is likely to be a winning strategy.
That's good. Let's get into some little more detail about what we can put on the checklist of things that have to be in order for the Kentucky Derby to start. And one of them that comes to mind is supply chain. And this is a topic that anybody who's watching the news is starting to recognize is a critical item for any business. We're talking right now about international supply chains, getting a hold of products that are manufactured here, there, and everywhere, and making sure that you get your order fulfilled. How do you think we should approach the supply chain concept in this new world?
Well, I think the threat to the supply chain is not just finished products and international, but I mean, even domestic. I was reading this morning, there are threats to the chicken production in the US, and there's a question about the availability of protein. So I think what you want to do if you're running a business is break down the components of your supply chain and make sure that you have redundancy in terms of availability, right? So in the case of this lab business where I'm on the board, you've got to have PPE, personal protective equipment. You got to have reagents for the lab machinery that you run. You got to have pipettes and test tubes and things like that. Those come from a variety of different suppliers. Not all of those suppliers may be immediately available in order to facilitate your starting the Kentucky Derby, right? So you've got to reach out to those suppliers and make sure that you have visibility into is everything going to be available that you have to have? And I would recommend making sure that you have a couple of sources in case something fails, right? So if you look at the way the whole search for PPE has gone, when we knew we had a shortage in the US of PPE, personal protective equipment, masks, gowns, gloves, we realized that a lot of that was produced in China. And so there was a scramble by 50 states and the federal government to try to track down as much of that inventory as they possibly could. And they ended up in a bidding war until ultimately, I hope the federal government kind of took an ascendant role and said, well, we're going to have FEMA be the primary buyer and then we'll redistribute. But in business, you're not going to have that luxury, right? So like if you're Hotel Tango and you got to have corn, what if everybody else is buying up the backlog of available corn? Or sometimes you work with what's called grain neutral spirits, GNS. It's the distilled, kind of the first level product that comes from distilling corn. Got to have GNS for making hand sanitizer, which Hotel Tango has kind of shifted gears right now into making a lot of hand sanitizer. Are you going to be able to source that? And if you can't source it from your primary contractor, then who are secondary and tertiary sources for that? So it's just an example of the forward thinking that I think you're going to want to do to make sure that your supply chain is ready to go for restart.
Sounds like that's really an action item that you should be working on today.
Yeah, my guess is a lot of people have been working on it already. But I think you got to take it to the second and third order to make sure you have a lot of redundancy. I've actually written an article for the IBJ that's going to be coming out this weekend on the topic as well, because supply chain is really critical.
Great. Let's talk about your customers. A lot of times when we get into discussions with clients that we're mentoring, one of the important things to understand is whether the new business understands their customer, whether they know who their customer is, whether they know what their customer wants, how they think. Is it going to be the same when we come back? Will they necessarily, the customers just be the same old, or do you think things will change?
Well, it's going to be a function in some significant part by what type of business you're in, but I think it's very likely there's going to be changes in terms of the demand side. And the key is knowing your customers, communicating with them, making sure that you can accommodate whatever adjustments they're going to need to make. So, if you're running a restaurant and all of a sudden the restaurant's capacity is cut in half because of social distancing, their margin analysis is going to be significantly impacted. What if you're a supplier to the restaurant? What does that mean for your relationship? And I think you've got to drill down on those types of questions so that you really understand how's the demand side been affected by all of this. And really at the heart of it is communication. I think that your customers are very likely going to be scrambling on their own strategies here. And they may not know the definitive answer, but they're going to know, these are the things that are keeping me awake at night right now. These are the adjustments I know I'm going to have to make. And being a value-added partner in that discussion, I think, will go a long way toward cementing that relationship.
One of the things I was thinking about, just considering my own personal situation, is um, there are certain cautions that I'm now taking that I never would have thought of before. A lot of it has to do with social distancing and going in places with crowds, being forced to touch things that I don't know if they've been cleaned or not. But I've also got the feeling that maybe this isn't the same for everybody, that one generation is looking at this a little bit different than another. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's good observation. I mean, depending on the demographics of your workforce um, or your customer base, they may be more or less sensitized to risk, right? So if most of your employees are in their 20s, they're pretty confident that their mortality is not at stake here. If, on the other hand, you have a lot of 50 and 60-year-olds, their risk profile is a lot different. And if they're sedentary workers, right, and your workforce has a high incidence of obesity or diabetes, then the risk factors are even higher from what we know about COVID-19. So that's yet another variable to keep in mind. People will respond to the risks of reentering the workforce and re-engaging in the economy in different ways. That's a good point.
Along those same lines, that could that lead to, or should people in businesses now take a second look at their market channels and how they're where they're going to sell their product?
I think that's part of the asking yourself, who are your customers and how are they going to respond to this crisis? I mean, you may want to, for risk management reasons or otherwise, cost management, you may want to think about revisiting your market channels, your distribution channels, your sales channels. Do you want to ramp up internet sales and try to tamp down personal interaction? Again, that really turns on the nature of the business. If you're in a restaurant business, you have no choice. I mean, you might do carry out, you might do internet ordering, but a lot of the economics of your business depend on having diners come in, and you can't have as many as you used to. So how do you fill that hole? That's calculus that is really industry and business specific, but it's part of the inquiry, no question about it. A lot of the economic assumptions that we make when we create a business could be affected here. Some of them have changed significantly. Some of them are gone, right? So you've got to think about, identify what those risks are and make adjustments accordingly.
There's a lot of companies that have a website, and the website often is fairly static. It works, so they keep using it. Do you think that coming out of this lockdown that it'll be necessary to make some or maybe even significant changes in the kind of the message you're sending out across to your potential customers about the way you're doing business, or how it would be to do business with you?
I think people are going to be hungry for reassurance. Again, industry specific, but again, let's talk about the restaurant business again for a moment here, because it's going to be so significantly challenged. I noticed that a lot of restaurants and the large national pizza chains, for example, are saying that once the pizza comes out of the oven, it's not touched again by human hands. It is put into the box, sealed, and you can be sure that none of our employees have touched it after that point in time. That's part of the consumer psychology that they're trying to anticipate. If you're in the business of making industrial machinery, that's less of a concern, but there are other aspects to it that you have to account for. It's very hard for me to say across all industries, these are the things that you ought to look at. But I think for those people that are on the call, for your particular industry, you're going to have to revisit a lot of those assumptions. I think making assumptions right now is a very dangerous thing, because the rules have changed in ways that nobody really knows all of the ramifications of them yet.
Let's shift gears here. We talked about the supply chain. Let's talk about labor, the labor side of the equation. Most businesses need help. They need employees. And again, I think like the consumers may have changed, I think the employees may have changed, and maybe what's going to be necessary to attract and retain talent may have changed. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I think, we touched on this a minute ago about the demographics of your workforce. I think that a lot of employees are going to be kind of in shock coming out of this, almost like PTSD, because they've just been through an experience they've never had before. That's true for all of us. They've probably had their net worth materially affected if they had savings, and a lot of people don't, but if they had them, they've probably been drawn down or depleted. So they're scared, they're worried, and you have to accommodate that psychology. And when I say that, what I mean is you have to reassure them that this is going to be okay. And I think the best reassurance really comes through communication, and being a transparent leader. Transparent, referring here to acknowledging that you don't have all of the answers, but that we as a team we're going to find the best answers that we can. And when we find out that it's not the right way to go, we're going to change them, and we're going to change it together. But we're all in this together, and we're going to stick together and make it happen. And so I think you want to, in the back of your mind, you want to be thinking about rebuilding the morale of your workforce and the confidence that they had pre-pandemic.
Okay, that is a challenge in and of itself.
Oh, it's a huge challenge. Now, the flip side of it is, and this is kind of the lawyer in me coming out, business owners have to think about, okay, what are my duties to my employees and what's my legal exposure, right? I mean, am I going to get whacked by OSHA if I'm not giving everybody gloves to wear? Am I going to get sued if somebody gets sick because of an interaction that they had on behalf of our business? And there is no one size fits all answer for that. I would say that with regard to labor relations and the risks and the regulations around that, I would recommend taking a look at the Denton's website. Denton's, and you alluded to it in my bio, it's a law firm. It's here in Indianapolis, but it's a global law firm, has like 12,000 lawyers around the globe. Denton's has just a fantastic COVID-19 resource website that you can see at dentons.com, and it'll give you an overview of some of the legal issues. But it's not all legal. I think a lot of it is psychological and rebuilding morale.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There's likely to be what you might call regulatory changes. You mentioned OSHA. Well, right now, I don't think OSHA requires grocery clerks to wear gloves. I doubt if that's required. I mean, I doubt if the regulations have kept up with the current situation. So there'll be, I believe, perhaps a new regulatory overlay to all of this. But in business, usually you want to exceed the expectations of your customers. Would you also think that you're going to have to kind of invent some of this yourself to meet the customer's needs, sort of like your own regulations about how things work?
I think to the extent you can be proactive, you look like a good leader and a business person by anticipating things, right? So Kroger, which has done, as best I can tell, at least here in central Indiana, has done a masterful job of keeping its stores stocked. They rely on their employees, but they took the initiative on their own this week to say that all employees must wear masks while at work. I don't believe that's a legal requirement. I think that's just a Kroger workforce policy that they promulgated. And if you run a manufacturing facility, you might think about things like that, social distancing, ways to enforce the 6 or more feet of distance between employees to the extent that's possible, and try to anticipate. Government, and I worked for the government for a couple of years, so I can talk about this as an insider. Government is really good at regulating things after the fact. It's not all that good in anticipating novel issues, and we're definitely into novel issues. So I would say that if you're the head of a business today, I'd try to get ahead of government on this if I could.
Okay, let's switch back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, but maybe go a little bit deeper, and that is the business model itself that the entrepreneur is working with. I suspect some of what we're talking about here will cause that model to have different assumptions and different potential outcomes. You want to talk a little bit about how a business owner ought to work with the concept of what their business model is and how they can optimize it in the new world?
Yeah, ideally, you have some kind of financial model that you use for planning purposes. That can be the source of your KPIs in many cases as well. And assuming that you have something like that, if you don't, I would recommend trying to develop one. But assuming that you have one, what I would do is what's referred to in banking as stress testing. And that is, I would say, okay, if my cost of goods go up 20%, how does that cascade through my economic model for my business? If my revenue drops 30%, what happens? If both of those things happen at the same time, what happens? And think through the different scenarios that stress testing can provide you, and then ask yourself, okay, if I found myself in a situation like that, what would I do? I would lay off 20% of my workforce. I would sell only through the internet. I would take whatever actions were necessary for your particular business, but I wouldn't wait for those things to happen. I would try to anticipate them. And stress testing is a good way to do that.
Okay, that's good. We're getting a little bit down to the bottom on this discussion. I wanted to encourage the people who are participating in this to go ahead and use the Q&A format that is available with Zoom to put out your questions. We're not going to be turning on the microphones. We're going to be getting the questions and then reading them out loud so everybody hears them, and then go ahead and answer them. So if you have questions about anything that we've talked about up to this point, or even something we haven't talked about you wish we had, the next 5 minutes are going to be very, very important to that. So having said that, and taking this business model thing one step further, I'm always thinking of a simple example of a restaurant. That particular industry is really affected by so much of this because of the way they conducted business face to face in an enclosed space, tables, chairs, having one customer after the other sit in the same location, eat a meal, all of that sort of thing. And now that you're being told, and I've seen this in different states, one state said restaurants can reopen, but they have to keep 50% of the chairs empty. Another one said they have to keep 75% of the chairs empty. So you take that as an entrepreneur and you start working on your business model. What if you get to the point where it looks like, how can I make money under these new rules? What are some of the thought processes you might want to go through at that point?
Yeah, well, I mean, the worst case scenario is bankruptcy. People tend to think of bankruptcy as I lose and the business is gone. And there is a scenario for that in bankruptcy, Chapter 7. But there's also the reorganization chapter in bankruptcy, Chapter 11, which basically means you continue to operate, your management continues in place, your creditors are held at bay, your contracts become what are called executory, so you get flexibility in determining which contracts you adhere to and which contracts you don't. And so it's a definite concern to the psychology of your customers and your employees, but at the end of the day, it's kind of the final legal remedy. But short of that, well short of that, because I wouldn't want to do that unless there was absolutely no other alternative. I think we will see an increase in mergers and acquisitions. Before the pandemic, company valuations were at historic highs. I mean, highs that were going to be difficult to sustain in the long run. But there was a tremendous amount of capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for companies to be bought, what's referred to in the private equity world as dry powder. And just to put that in context, there is more dry powder in private equity today than the entire value of the public stock markets in the United States. Huge amounts of capital waiting for something to do. If you're in the private equity business or the venture capital business, you're of two minds. You want to be disciplined in putting that money to use, but if you don't put it to use, there's a lifespan to it, right? It goes away if you don't use it after a while. So there's pressure to put it to use. So in the context of mergers and acquisitions, there is capital looking for a home out there for good businesses. There are opportunities to buy other businesses that may supplement or expand your business model, that make your company more viable or more profitable. And in a situation like this, you will see values drop. I just think there's very little doubt that the historically high valuations that we saw pre-pandemic are going to get significantly adjusted for a year or maybe longer. I don't know. But I think you'll see a lot of M&A activity coming out of the pandemic.
That value drop is a two-edged sword. If you're holding the asset, your asset is worth less. And I could imagine for entrepreneurs who are have a strategic plan to sell their business at some point, the timing on that could definitely be affected by this.
Right. And if you have the financial capacity to withstand this period of time, that's worth doing. If, on the other hand, you're in severe economic pain, taking on capital now and retaining some ownership, which many private equity firms are happy to let the owner do, could be a viable strategy. There's an expression in venture capital that nobody ever died from dilution, right? Your rate of dilution of ownership at a lower valuation may be higher than it was a year ago and higher than what you want, but it also is not life-threatening. And a liquidity crunch or running out of cash is life-threatening.
Question related to the bankruptcy that I have. When you mentioned contracts and when you're in the reorganization, Chapter 11, the contracts, I guess to use a layman's term, can be renegotiated.
Right.
That would include your rental agreement, wouldn't it? Your lease, your property lease?
I'm not a bankruptcy expert, but my understanding is that all contracts in bankruptcy become negotiable.
Okay. And is Chapter 11, the reorganization, available to sole proprietors?
To the best of my knowledge, Chapter 11 is available to any business.
Okay.
Now, if you say sole proprietor, if you're not a corporation or an LLC, you're just an individual.
Right.
Chapter 11 may not be available for an individual, but it is for business enterprises. I'm not certain about that. I'd have to check that.
Okay. That was just a question that popped into my head.
I mean, I think if all of a sudden I couldn't make my mortgage payment, could I go into Chapter 11 and renegotiate my mortgage? No, I don't think so. Now I could go into liquidation, Chapter 7, or maybe a different chapter for individuals. But the upshot of it would be that the secured lender would take their collateral. They'll do it under the supervision of the bankruptcy court, but at the end of the day, I think they prevail in that scenario.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question, and then we're ready to switch to the Q&A. So if anybody out there has a Q and wants an A, just type it in there. Before we go to that, I was just going to ask you if you just had kind of word from you on this whole topic in general, kind of the big picture advice.
Well, I think that this is a time and an opportunity where leadership is going to make a huge difference. It's not business as usual. It is charting a new course, and it may be a dramatically different course than what people were on before. If I've learned one lesson in my business career, it is that communication is the key. In law school, they tell you to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. And I think that's true in business too. Over communicating, it's difficult to over communicate, particularly when people are scared and perhaps emotionally scarred by this whole experience. So that would be observation number one. Communication, over communication will be a key to success. And the other is humility. I mean, as smart as you may be, nobody's going to have all the answers here. And conceding that you don't have the answers, but asking the questions and being open to getting input from others, I think will lead to a better outcome ultimately.
Okay, good. Let's see if we can work the technology here and have a question to start off our Q&A with. So I'm hoping to hear from Tom, who's our third party here. Got it. Maybe Tom will unmute his microphone and read the question or flash it up on the screen. This is sort of new territory for us.
Hi, Tom here. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I was wrestling, as you said, with the new technology.
That's good.
First, thank you very much, Bill and Matt, for the good information, and Matt sharing your expertise and Bill asking your questions. We do have some questions from our participants, and they continue to come in. So I'll do my best to consolidate them and ask them. So first question is a question from Logan, and he types, as an owner of a scenic tour company catering to crowds of hundreds of people, I wonder what your suggestion would be for tourism-related businesses like ours who primarily depend on customers visiting en masse. My largest concern right now is fluctuation in consumer confidence to get out and be around other people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure that a lot of us have travel plans for later this year, and some of them may be outside the United States, and what's going to happen there. And honestly, that's a good question, and I don't have a definitive answer to it. I think what I would do if I were Logan and in that kind of a business, though, is I would try to think about the psychology of the customer and what is it that what are they going to be safest in their minds? That is, what environments would be most conducive to their feeling like they could safely take the risk of engaging in this activity. So to the extent that you can be outside, that would be better than being inside. To the extent that you're inside, being apart is obviously better than being in close proximity to other people. And if you are or have to be in close proximity to other people, what reassurances can you offer your customers that this is going to be safe? Are you going to provide masks? Are you going to glove them? What other things are you going to do? Are you going to, for example, if you have tour buses, what's the frequency of cleaning your tour buses, and how are you going to sanitize them? And how do you communicate that to prospective customers so that they can feel good about getting on that tour bus? So I don't know when you say the travel industry, that's pretty broad, and those may or may not be components of your business, but that's the type of thinking I would try to engage in.
Okay, thank you. The travel industry is certainly one of the hardest hit with all of this, because the concept there is grouping up and even just getting on that airplane. If that airplane isn't full, the airline isn't making the kind of money they want to make. So that's a tough one.
But there is kind of a silver lining in my mind to that, and that is that airplanes and airplane bathrooms and hotels and other travel places like that are going to be cleaner than they've ever been before, and they're going to be cleaned a lot more often. I used to travel to China quite a bit on business, and every time I got back from China, I could just count on a 7-day horrific cold, presumably from being in recirculated air for long periods of time. I think things like that are going to get a lot of scrutiny going forward, and so hopefully the sanitary standards are going to improve as a result of this.
Good. Tom, you want to come back with another question?
Great, absolutely, and thank you for those answers. So the next question comes from Kristen, and it is echoed by Tanya, so kind of two combined in one. Kristen says, what does the 90-day sprint entail? What should be accomplished during this time frame that applies to all businesses, and what are the steps? And Tanya says, to echo what Kristen asked, what are the steps to do a 90-day sprint?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, if you have an annual business plan or a 3-year strategic plan or whatever, I would go back and look at the last full quarter that you operated in pre-pandemic and say to yourself, okay, what were the KPIs, the key performance indicators that I was either measuring or at least internalizing to determine whether we were running our business successfully or not. And then I would take the last unaffected quarters KPIs, and I would throw them forward. So the bell rings, we're back in business. Yes, there's some ramp up time, but my competitors are, I'm going to presume, all going to go at this at 100% effort. What are the KPIs that I want to stretch to accomplish in that first quarter when we reopen the business? And I concede that it's aggressive and ambitious, and you probably aren't going to be able to accomplish all of them. But I also think that it's worth the effort, and you'll be further along up the curve than you would have been otherwise if you hadn't done it. So in terms of what are the steps, I would say look at the business plan, look at the quarterly milestones that you achieved or pre-pandemic you were working on, and then take those, reset them into the coming quarter, make sure that you have measurable KPIs so that there are numbers that can be tracked and performance measured against in the coming quarter. Make sure that everybody in your employee group feels like they have had an opportunity to contribute to that, and they feel like they own those numbers. Everybody knows that it's ambitious, but let's try to do this as a team, and then put them out there and make sure that everybody is accountable for some metric. Everybody has a number, and be humble about it and say, we don't know how this is going to go. We may change the numbers, but we'll do it as a group, and we'll make adjustments as we see fit.
I was thinking too, this unfortunately may reveal to some businesses, some companies, what they haven't been doing and what they wish they had been doing. And it's kind of a little bit of a do-over opportunity. If the business had not been careful enough with their supply chain on the same basis, they had one vendor and they realized, oh my gosh, if he goes, we go. And now they're worried. Is he going to go? Is he not going to go? It's time to kind of go back to the basics. Setting KPIs implies a certain amount of planning and budgeting. I mean, you talked about that. If there was no planning, if there was no budgeting, now's the best time to start and recognize that. And if it's the first time you're looking ahead instead of just fighting fires or handling crises, start with something that makes sense. Share it with your people and set the goals so you know if you're on the right track as you move forward.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Everybody's kind of in the same boat right now. Nobody knows exactly what the future holds. Everybody is restarting at about the same time. That is in many ways a blessing, right? It is an opportunity to reset. If you don't have a prospective view of your business, you need to develop one now. And it's imperfect, it's prognostication, it will change, but you're better off for going through the exercise. Your comment about the supply chain, I have to think that, of the 60 people that are on the phone, there are people that depend on supplies from foreign countries and possibly from China. I think what you're going to see is major disruption in terms of international supply chains, particularly from China. There's going to be a government push to onshore as much supply chains, particularly in sensitive industries, much more than there ever was before. So the concept of just-in-time manufacturing is going to be really challenged because you're going to have to reconstruct your supply chain if you've been dependent upon foreign sources, particularly Chinese.
Okay, Tom, how about another question?
All right, yeah, we've got a question here from Dawn. She says, as a small LLC business that sells novelty items to theme parks, zoos, destination venues, and events, I really don't want to file bankruptcy, but would rather reorganize if possible. Any suggestions? I know this gets us into financial portion, but maybe a short comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenging position to be in right now, Dawn. I would say that you're going to have a lot of volatility with your buyers. And I don't know whether there are other categories of buyers that you can locate right now. So one approach might be to develop a strategy where there's like a 90-day freeze, or maybe you suspend operations and try to mitigate expenses until the recovery is further along. That's a function of how much capital you have available and how much pain you can withstand, because I think for a while, it's going to be tough to find a lot of demand from amusement parks and places like that. But I'm hazarding a guess here. I would certainly look for other categories of potential buyers to try to mitigate that risk.
Okay, yeah. These are tough situations. I guess the good news is that the Disney company isn't going to go away either. They're going to figure out a way to open their parks. The question is how quickly will the customers come back? So that interim period is definitely the painful one.
Right.
Tom?
Okay, thank you very much. And here's an interesting question, as they all are, from Christina. For background, Christina does residential and commercial cleaning. And her question is, any advice as we plan to reopen when furloughed employees don't want to come back because unemployment benefits are greater than average salary?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We struggle with that a little bit at Hotel Tango Whiskey, just because of the, when you hire a waiter, for example, the unemployment benefits might be equal to or greater than what they would otherwise make, at least on an hourly rate basis. I don't know. I'm not sure I have a really good answer for that. I mean, I think that you have to create enough incentive for the employees that are on unemployment to come back. Unemployment is not unlimited, right? It goes on for a limited amount of time, and then the employee is going to have to find something else to do. So letting them know that if you're not with us now, don't plan on being with us in the future, might be a good message. I do think, while we're on the topic of a cleaning business, though, it occurs to me that you do have kind of an opportunity, and that is that people that have homes and they've been cooped up for 60 days with family members and dogs and things like that are going to really be interested in a deep clean, and not just a deep clean as traditionally defined, but maybe a level of sanitization that is extraordinary. And so you may be able to charge a higher price for a sanitizing clean, post-pandemic sanitizing clean.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Nate asks, what would you recommend to a B2B business that's trying to sell services? It seems most companies are freezing spending and investment.
I think this comes down to talking to your customers to find out what their needs are, right? In the case of Denton's, for example, sad to say, but I think it's clear that there are going to be a lot of bankruptcies. And so the lawyers at Denton's are gearing up, and I'm sure this is true of all law firms, for higher levels of bankruptcy. So in a B2B business, whatever it may be, I think you've got to talk to your customers and find out what are their needs going to be. What are they willing to pay for? If you're an accounting firm and they don't want to pay for audited financials anymore, well then what does your lender require? Can you get by with a lower level of attestation from your accounting firm? Are there other services that can be provided that help them kind of meet their new reality? And that's the creative thought process that I think you're going to want to go through in terms of meeting their needs.
All right.
Okay. Bill, did you have a comment?
No, I'm good with that.
Okay. So here's a question from Debbie. As a lone person previously running a retail clothing store, where and how to attract new workers, especially to delegate some of the many new obligations to sell and clean and use the internet, etc. So it's basically a question about how to attract new workers to the retail clothing industry.
Yeah. Well, I got to believe that there are going to be a lot of dislocated workers coming out of this pandemic. A lot of the jobs that existed before are probably going to go away or get redefined. I have to think that there are a lot of restaurants that are not going to be able to make the economics work post-pandemic. And so you're going to have a new class of people come on the market that maybe you did not traditionally hire, but that you can hire going forward. So it's really a function of, okay, if that's true, then how do I recruit them? You know, do I go on LinkedIn? Do I go on Indeed? Is this a Facebook campaign? How do I scoop up those people that are going to be looking for something to do?
It's a little complicated by the unemployment question facts that are swirling around here. When that extra $600 drops off, then we're back to a more normal world here. But you've got the competition kind of going with effectively a change in the market rate scale, because until you can meet or beat what they could get for not working, the rational person may not be working.
Yeah, although, you know, if you're on unemployment, and this I realize is driven by the age of the people that we're talking about, right? But if you're on unemployment, what are you going to do for health insurance? What kind of benefits do you have? And if somebody's offering the same $600, but there is some kind of benefit in addition to that, it may change the calculus. Now, if you're 25 and you're bulletproof and immortal, maybe you don't care about those things. But if you're 35, it might look a lot different.
Right. Tom, you have another question there? Tom.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Kristen asks, what advice do you have to people who are looking to launch a startup, a new business during this time? Is there anything that's different that should be done versus someone restarting a business?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, traditionally, companies that have been started up as we're coming out of crises, financial or otherwise, have done better than most. Because their capital demands are generally lower because they have more of a lean operating philosophy than when there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system and people are a little more profligate in how they spend, and investors are willing to fund that many times. So it's actually, ironically, maybe a good time to start a business. But you've got to think about what's the environment that you're launching in, and what's your value proposition. What is it that makes you better or more attractive or more economic than some other incumbent that's currently operating in that space, right? But if you're starting from scratch or you're starting anew, you don't have a lot of the legacy problems that those that were operating pre-pandemic might have. So you may have a bit of an advantage right now.
Okay, thank you. Tom, another question?
Yes, okay. We've got one from Tanya, and she asks, how do we hire new contractors and have them fill out I-9 forms if we're not able to check their documents in person? The documents once required that the company examine proof of eligibility to work in the U.S. in person.
Can they mail them to you? I don't know.
I don't know. That's a tough question. I'm really kind of out of my realm on that issue. Immigration regulation is very specialized, number one. Number two, it's in a constant state of flux for the last several years. And number three, I think what you're going to see is the Trump administration making it harder not easier for immigrants to get work, on the theory that as we reemploy people coming out of this, we want to reemploy citizens, including naturalized citizens. So the lawyer in me says, don't let down your guard in terms of documentation, and you're going to want to be able to prove again that you went through all of the formalities there. And if for some reason the ability to check that, like the website, is not reliable or not available, then I would have to say I would talk to my lawyer or somebody that knows more about it than I do in terms of how to make sure you cover that base. But don't just think that you can ask for forgiveness a year from now if there's a problem, because that is generally not the nature of government.
Tom, I would suggest you ask Tanya to send you her email address and have we have some SCORE mentors who are HR experts, and they could start a conversation, and maybe we can help out that way. Okay, how about another question, Tom? Tom's making a note here of what I just said.
Yeah, exactly. I've discovered that I can't ask a question and type on here at the same time.
I got a pen and paper sitting next to me. You'd be amazed.
Well, I was answering to a Q&A here. Anyway, so Michael says, I own a small chain of theaters in southern Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. I applied for and received the PPP loan this week. However, the film companies are not releasing any movies for us until July 17. So it really won't do me any good to open until then. This will be outside the 8-week period the PPP is good for. Any suggestions?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I have not heard that before about film production or film distribution being halted until July. I don't know whether you could, in the interim, make a go of it with, running old movies. Make it a double feature kind of thing, and you're serving hot dogs and beer to the adults. Some permutation like that. Whether there would be a way to show videos or other things. I know there are licensing issues with that. I think what I would probably do for starters is contact the office of your representative, or Senators Young or Braun. They have local offices in Indianapolis and other places, and they might be able to get you a resource that could help you think through that. I don't, off the top of my head, know of anything else that could be helpful.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And also thanks to the wizardry of technology backing up a step where Tanya had asked a question about the, sorry, let me back up here. She had asked a question about, checking the
I-9 information.
Thank you. So there was an answer here, if I can find it, that from Ruth. She says that the answer to the question is that the company I recently was hired for used a system like DocuSign and had me to give the email address of someone who knows me to upload those docs and verify that I am who I say I am. So I guess that's a acceptable workaround for the I-9 to be in person. to use the DocuSign system and then have somebody else upload the docs and verify that they are who they say they are. So thank you for that, Ruth. That's an illustration of how we've got to be creative during these times of COVID, and hopefully that takes care of that.
It sounds like also illustration of helping each other here. It's added to our panelist power.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left if we have any more questions. What do we see there, Tom?
Yeah, I'm scrolling through here. I think while there's very many good questions, and I thank everybody for their engagement. There's also a question here of what would you recommend to entrepreneurs who have business completely online that is clothing, art, and education related? How can we get a head start in using this, quote, restart, unquote, in the country to get more clients for our business?
Well, I think the good news is that everybody is relying on the internet in ways that they would never have imagined. And so the number of eyeballs that are out there have gone up exponentially. Question is, how do you get their attention? And I'm not a marketing expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know that, like at Hotel Tango, we use a lot of social media. There's a cost associated with it, but the performance is quantifiable, right? If you buy a billboard, other than traffic counts, you really don't know how many people see that ad or act upon it. Whereas if somebody lands on your Facebook page or clicks on your Instagram post, you can get metrics around that. So you can calculate the ROI better. Given the nature of the business, if you're entirely online, I think the market has actually expanded, all things being equal, and people are more comfortable buying things online and having them shipped than they ever were before. So this may be a time of tremendous opportunity for you.
That's like the opposite of some of the questions. I mean, they're in the right place. If there is a right place, being online, that's been enhanced. The delivery services, the online activities are currently going gangbusters, whereas some of the face-to-face activities, event activities, places that you have to be involved with the crowd are just the opposite. So
Well, I was just going to say there may be an adjacency to the current business online that makes it even more attractive, right? So I alluded to Hotel Tango, the artisan distillery, but we're selling a tremendous amount of hand sanitizer these days, and it's kind of filled the gap of the tasting room operations. So look for adjacent spaces that will make that online business even more relevant than it is today.
good. That is the last question that we're going to be taking today. So that wraps us up. And I really want to thank Matt Neff for joining us today. I think we've accomplished a lot. I do want to mention that this is a SCORE workshop, and we do continue with our mentoring. We've gone to Zoom and conference calls where the Zoom isn't possible, but our website, indianapolis.score.org, is a place to go to sign up for mentoring, and we can keep talking. We're actually, during this pandemic, doing about the same amount of mentoring. We really weren't sure what was going to happen when we canceled the face-to-face, but we're rolling. If you've got needs or questions or want to talk to us, please do. And I appreciate it. So we're going to end the session now. I think if this works like it has in the past, as you go through the logout procedure, it'll ask you if you want to do a feedback questionnaire. And if it does, please do. And if it doesn't, we'll send you one separately. So please give us feedback so we can schedule things in the future. And Matt, again, thanks a lot. And we're finished.
Thank you all. Good luck out there.
Okay, and I think, Matt, you may be the one that ultimately shuts this down.
Okay, here we go. Bye, everyone.
Bye.